Nellie Bowles.
Very wise.
Well, we are here for an auspicious occasion, which is the home birth of our child. That's 2 months away. But you've birthed something else, which is this incredible new book, your first book, which obviously I am a hardcore wife guy and I'm hopelessly biased. But I think that this book, Morning After the Revolution, Dispatches from the Wrong Side of History, yes, that is the full title, is incredible. And I happen to have sort of like lived alongside you for the whole gestation of the book. And the book sort of begins where our relationship did. And it's just really funny and emotional to sit here in our home with our baby in the other room, another baby on the way, and think back to the person that I met in 2018, really before or maybe as the revolution, as you call it, was beginning. So let's kind of go back in time. It's 2018. We met in the New York Times cafeteria for the first time on the 5th floor. Who were you back then in 2018 when I met you and you were a reporter at the New York Times?
God, it's funny to go back all the way there. I was a very confident young reporter at the Times, rising up, doing really well and having a lot of fun. I had started as a tech reporter in San Francisco. I was out in New York meeting with editors because I'd started doing bigger features that touched on politics and bigger topics, and I was having a blast. I was whatever struck my mind as interesting or whatever my curiosity kind of landed on that day, I would pitch it and editors would say yes, and I was off to the races and doing very well at the job that I always had wanted. Before I got the job, I would look in the mirror, like when I was talking to the woman who would become my editor and who was a great boss, I would look in the mirror and I would say, "Hi, Nellie Bowles from the New York Times. Hi, it's Nellie Bowles with the New York Times. Nellie, New York Times. Yeah, calling for," like I would like rehearse this. Like I was obsessed with this place, and I believed in the literature of it and in the like slogans as almost religious gospel. I believed in them. When they said the truth is hard, I thought, yeah, the truth is hard. And when all of that stuff, all of the sort of beautiful romance we have around the life of a journalist, I really believed in, and I saw it as a calling.
But I think at the time it was really hard for you to imagine that the New York Times was anything other but those slogans. And I remember when we met saying to you, maybe like second or third date, like, this is gonna have an impact on your career. And you looked at me like I was kind of crazy.
Yeah, well, I thought you were crazy. Basically, my arc at the paper was I went from a few very easy, successful years to then towards the end of 2019, maybe middle of 2019, as what we now can see is a revolution was rising. It resisted having a name, of course. I hate the term like sort of the woke movement or whatever because it's so flattening. And I think the early days of woke were actually kind of cool and interesting. But whatever you want to call the revolution that we all just have seen over the last 5 years, when that started coming, I wanted to cover parts of it. I wanted to report on it. It was really interesting. I had been being rewarded for doing reporting on really interesting moments that were happening and finding interesting characters. And this was really interesting. And I was becoming kind of obsessed with what was going on. It was amazing. You would see groups of anti-fascists taking over a neighborhood in Seattle. All of this stuff was going on. At the same time, I met you and we were falling in love. And these two things started making it impossible for me within the paper. It was both my curiosity about kind of avenues of reporting that weren't going to necessarily help, let's say, Joe Biden's reelection chances or something like that, which, yeah, we'll get to that. But and starting to date you, that kind of simultaneously then all of a sudden made life much harder for me there. I had an editor, a great guy, say to me, in the office, in front of a group of colleagues, all of us having a drink, "I can't believe you would go on a date with Barry Weiss." And I was like trying to laugh. I don't know, like it was an editor. And he said, she's a Nazi. She's a fucking Nazi. Straight to my face. And I was like,
what did you think in that moment? Because you didn't tell me about that at all at the time, because you didn't want to upset me. Do you remember that?
yeah, I told you like, what, a couple months later?
Yeah.
In the moment, I was getting a little bit used to people saying really inappropriate things to me about you and about my curiosity about some of these reporting topics. And I thought I want to just get out of this situation. I want to just like get him to move on.
Yeah.
And he really was on it, but I was embarrassed. I was super embarrassed. I didn't want to be on the outs. And I didn't want to not please the editors around me. I wanted to please them. This was the only place I ever thought I would be. So it was sort of like, this is a person I'm going to have for the rest of my life as an editor. What do I do? Like I was panicked maybe. And so, and also I didn't want to get him in trouble because I really liked him and I like him. Like, and that's what's so crazy maybe.
I think like the theme that comes through in everything that you do is your just total openness and curiosity about the world. And it was weirdly that curiosity that became your Achilles heel.
Well, it does always get me in trouble. Even now it gets me in trouble. I can't help myself with it. But the thing that shifted really as after the Nazi comment, it was almost explicit that the coverage at the Times and the coverage at every mainstream liberal publication had to explicitly help Joe Biden's reelection. And it became like, it has to help the party. And that used to be maybe subtly, or, journalists have always been liberal. It's not like, that's not a surprise. Like, I thought my politics fit in just great. But it became much more explicit and stated. And
let's explain that for people, right? So one example I really remember, and this is a chapter in your new book, was during the rioting of the summer of 2020, right? There were peaceful BLM protests, but then of course there were violent riots that left whole cities, or at least parts of cities, destroyed in their wake. And you were a business reporter at the time, and I remember you saying, this is a really interesting business story.
Yeah.
I want to go to Kenosha. Because the whole story that was being told is, oh, all those small business owners have insurance, it's no big deal. And you were skeptical about that. Tell us about the decision to go and report that story, and then what happened, because this is really what I remember, in the wake of you coming back with the story that you did.
So I'd been wanting to find different underreported bits of all the little explosions we were seeing around the country. And Kenosha was a really interesting one because in Kenosha, the wealthy white commercial district all was very well insured and had a sort of commercial business association that when they saw the protests turning into riots and turning more violent, they boarded up immediately. It was all kind of spick and span done. I think they lost one business down there, and it was pretty tight. And if they did lose a business, they had insurance. The neighborhood that ended up being burned was the multicultural, primarily not white, poor business district. And there, all of the small businesses were underinsured. We're talking about little like cell phone shops and this and that. They were all vastly underinsured because most people aren't thinking about catastrophic loss, total loss. They're thinking maybe someone will steal a cell phone case or two and we'll have to get that reimbursed, but they're not thinking catastrophic loss. And so the district that was burned was this poor minority-owned district. And the city was scrambling to try to figure out how to pay for the rebuild. And so I wanted to go and see with my own eyes what happened there. Mm-hmm. I wanted to see what I'd only seen through super partisan media. Mm-hmm. So at the time, the only media coverage out of these cities was either right-wing media that was saying like, Antifa destroyed the entire city of Kenosha, like all caps, like it's like you've seen the YouTubes,
of course,
and then left-wing media that's like peaceful protest, like
The fiery but peaceful CNN.
Exactly.
Right.
And I was sort of going crazy with that. I was like, what's actually going on? So I pitched that great business story. I come back with that story, and basically, I mean, it sounds so petty now, but it's basically slow rolled. It's basically that we're not going to have space to run a story about what happened in Kenosha. We're not going to have space. And more than explicit lies about what was happening in 2020, how the mainstream media controlled the narrative was by not covering it. That was the most important thing. It was to ignore it. And it was to all of us collectively agree to ignore it.
We were on different sides of the paper, right? So I was on the opinion side, you were on the news side. But we saw different versions of the same story, which is things that adhered to the convenient, politically helpful narrative sort of sailed in.
Yeah,
and
of course.
Anything that didn't was scrutinized, caveated, slow-rolled, etc. Now, Kenosha was one story I really remember you doing. The other story I really remember now was the story that you did about, I don't remember if the end of the day the name was CHAZ or CHOP, but this autonomous zone in Seattle.
Yes.
Would you read from a little part of that chapter?
Why, I would. This was a time when the mainstream media toyed with the idea that righteous vigilantes were good, very good, and only the weak-kneed would question whether the protest should have a little edge, that frisson of danger. People's hearts are always in the right place. The protest was fiery but peaceful, is how a now famous CNN chyron described one Antifa outing. The correspondent was reporting against a backdrop of raging fires as the word peaceful sat on the screen. The scene looked comically unpeaceful. "We don't have time to finger wag at protesters about property," said Black Lives Matter co-founder Alicia Garza. Ignoring destruction of a local business became official policy for New York-based media. David Remnick, the editor of The New Yorker, wrote a meditation at the height of the protest, asking, who really is the agitator here? He cites Martin Luther King Jr. Even looting, King insisted, is an act of catharsis, a form of shocking the white community by abusing property rights. Then King quoted Victor Hugo to deepen his point. If a soul is left in the darkness, sins will be committed. The guilty one is not he who commits the sin, but he who causes the darkness. That's the kicker to Remnick's essay. NPR held a friendly Q&A about the importance of riots and looting as a protest tactic, with the author of a book titled simply, In Defense of Looting. Nicole Hannah-Jones, the creator of the 1619 Project, and by then the most famous American reporter, agreed. Violence is when an agent of the state kneels on a man's neck until all of the life is leached out of his body. Destroying property, which can be replaced, is not violence. To use the same language to describe these two things is not moral, she told CBS News. Anyway, Antifa itself was just fun. Masked vigilantes have always saved the world, became the media's line. Another prominent Times reporter tweeted, if your grandfather fought in the war against Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, they were Antifa. Writer and director W. Camus Bell did a special on Antifa for CNN. Antifa is short for anti-fascist, he said. Picture a table. On one side of the table is Hitler and Mussolini, and on the other side is the popular performer Rafi. Which side of the table are you sitting on? I'm with Rafi. In a video called The Real Antifa, the Lincoln Project, a lobbying group for Democrats spearheaded by former Republicans, showed clips of World War II soldiers while a gravelly-voiced narrator read, anti-fascism. It's not a cable news talking point. It's an American ideal that should be memorialized. Or perhaps another way of putting it, loot and burn everything. Fuck this. Who the fuck cares about looting? Wrote Imani Gandhi, an editor with the progressive Rewire news group. Stop killing us. Maybe destroying small businesses was good. Small businesses aren't unionized. Small businesses aren't accountable. All those little burned-out shops were part of the structural problem. Bhaskar Sunkara, president of The Nation, a major leftist magazine, said essentially that it was bad tactics but good politics to end small businesses. So if by attack small businesses, you mean encourage the looting of them, sure, that's technically counterproductive. But we should aim to undermine small business owners with pro-worker legislation/unions and to reconstitute them as worker-controlled state firms or co-ops. A writer from the progressive magazine Jacobin joined in. We shouldn't fetishize mom and pops. They offer lower wages, skimpier benefits, and inferior labor protections. Delighted by the warm press reception, random members of Antifa started releasing their own statements and appearing on news shows, their faces backlit to keep anonymity. The use of violence is a tactic of how we keep our communities safe, an anonymous member told Nightline. The whole point of protesting is to make people uncomfortable, said Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. A Slate magazine headline read, "Nonviolence is an important tool for protests, but so is violence." The rhetoric at the time was, at best, heated, even occasionally exceeding the ever-polite Trump. One prominent activist and media darling tweeted at Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, "I'm going to be the person who watches the life leave your eyes."
So there's
It's hardcore. I mean, the rhetoric was insane. The rhetoric was wild. And now, of course, it's being memory holed. All of it's being memory holed. Like, obviously, the stuff around Antifa and people pretend like,
well,
because at the time, the context for that section is people were pretending Antifa wasn't real. And the media's job was to pretend Antifa wasn't real. And if Antifa was real,
it was
then
good. And that was sort of the move with constant things, right? It wasn't just about Antifa. That same rhetorical move is the thing doesn't exist, the thing doesn't exist, the thing doesn't exist. But when it's proven that it exists, it was good.
Yes.
Now, you, unlike many people, actually saw Antifa with your own eyes.
Yes.
In many of the stories that you did, whether it was in Portland, if I recall,
yeah.
and then, of course, in this CHAZ CHOP Seattle Autonomous
Zone.
So
in that summer, a group of anti-fascists took over a neighborhood of Seattle. It actually was the gay neighborhood. And they set up borders. They installed their own sort of security system. And they said, within these blocks are no police and no ambulances and no outsiders without our permission. This is a new city. This is a new land. It's the autonomous zone. The mayor of Seattle endorsed it, embraced it. She supplied it. She brought in porta potties and brought in fences to help them build their borders of their new city. She thought it was kind of fun. And I mean, needless to say, all of her text messages from that period mysteriously disappeared and were just accidentally deleted afterwards. And she has promised better data retention, better record retention methods in the future. But yeah, she embraced it. And so what was happening at that moment was that we were being told that the Black Lives Matter protests had no Antifa element and no sort of violent element, that they were all just peaceful, and any part that was violent was probably a conservative, right-wing white supremacist trying to undermine the BLM movement. And so that was kind of the explanation for what you were seeing on TV. And what you were seeing was cities lit on fire and, chaos and violence, and also beautiful protests, and also like peaceful things. It was the mix, but it was a mix that included violence. And Seattle gave away the lie a little bit. And because there you saw the complete and public alliance of Antifa and BLM. Now, what is Antifa and why is it interesting and why is it important to say it was entwined? It's because Antifa believes in violent protest and the frisson of more violence. The idea that that we're not going to just talk about our goals. Antifa brings that in and says, this is now on the table. BLM had a softer reputation. It was nonviolent marches. It was being embraced by corporate America, glossy magazines. And so
every major brand.
Yeah. And so Antifa was tricky for the brand, but it was very useful for the actual tangible actions and to make that protest a little bit fiery, which made it a little more dramatic and made it a little, gave it that energy. And so at the time, basically the mainstream press, including the New York Times, was openly lying about the connection between these groups. But I went to these places. I went to Seattle, I went to Portland, I went to Kenosha, and the alliance was completely real. They were all working together as one movement for that period of time. And how do I know it's Antifa? Antifa, they say they're a leaderless autonomous movement. They all dress alike. They carry guns. They mask their faces. It's a so-called leaderless movement that is extraordinarily disciplined and extraordinarily organized.
I remember And I think one of the reasons that these stories that you did, whether about Kenosha or Seattle, were so complicated is the caricatured two-dimensional story we were all meant to believe was that these protests were made up of marginalized minority populations and they were fighting the man, to put it in the, their language, the cis-het, white, heteronormative, blah, blah, blah. We could throw in more jargon there. But actually what your stories revealed is that it was so much more complicated. And the character that brought that to life for me was this Muslim gay cafe owner whose cafe, unfortunately, happened to be located in the center of this autonomous zone. Tell me a little bit about him and what you discovered through his story.
Okay, so basically, when I was in Seattle, I ended up spending time with a few small business owners, including Faisal Khan. And he basically described to me how, because he had joined a lawsuit against the city, to say to the city, you guys either owe me some cash back for the broken windows, you got to move the borders of your new autonomous zone because delivery vehicles can no longer come in to pick up, Uber Eats orders or something. My business is crashing. My windows are being smashed. It is a disaster. The city has to help, right? So a bunch of business owners had gotten together and done this lawsuit. Because he had joined that then he was targeted more. And targeted, we're talking about young white men with large guns who were very intimidating and very scary. And it wasn't crazy to be scared of them. They would smash your glass again as soon as you replace it. And they were marching around at night. You would see these shaky videos that were coming out of these autonomous zones, Seattle in particular, at night. And it was people opening the trunks of cars, handing out long guns to different sort of new security operators. Where you have a vacuum of power, what do you think is going to happen? So when I was there, I'm wandering around, I'm hanging out, I'm kind of chatting with business owners. What's going on, guys? And you've got a couple different security forces happening. You've got these kind of really sweet BLM security team who wander around and they're like, we're with BLM. And you've got the paid security, and they are wearing bulletproof vests, and they're like the guys who guard banks, basically, who are there, and they're walking around and they're saying, you pay me a little bit. Everyone, the BLM guys were also asking to be paid. The paid security was saying, pay me and I'll guard you. And then you have...
So it's basically
then you have the
Seattle's
Antifa
versions
guys.
of warlords. And
Oh, yeah.
people are paying off.
Oh, 100%. And everyone, and maybe you have to pay off a few of these different security teams. And then the third team is the Antifa team, who are these sort of squirrely looking, very pale white guys wandering around also saying they're providing security and they're monitoring. They kind of monitored me the closest. But yeah, where you have a vacuum, you have all these groups. It was just crazy. But it was, as a reporter, it was so rich.
Here you are in an American city, in a progressive American city, and there's basically different warlords being paid off by people like Faisal Khan. And this is being portrayed by the local government as, Coachella in the city.
Yeah.
But it turns. And what happens?
What happens, basically people were shot. And one young person was shot, CHAZ stayed opened. And then another young person was shot and died. And then CHAZ, after that, was shut down. The father of that young man has a lawsuit against the city, and he alleges that basically the kid was put on a folding table and basically bled out, and then finally was thrown into a car and brought to the hospital, but it was too late. And ambulances wouldn't go into these places. You try to figure out who shot him, who killed him, and all the evidence is all cleaned up by the time the cops get in there. They're blocked from getting in. Everything's picked up and cleaned up. And
now, thinking back on this, right, the idea that the mayor, the police in a city would sort of step away and allow for this to happen. It reminds me in a way of what's happening on campuses across the country right now. We can get there in a bit. But looking back, how do you understand, and maybe it's impossible to know, why they made the decisions they did? Why did they allow this to happen? Why would they provide the porta potties? Why would they allow for anarchy in their cities?
I think that there was a real belief after the rightful horror that people felt watching the video of George Floyd. There was a real belief that nothing could be worse than American police. And American police are so bad that we ought to try everything, anything. Why not? And so it was a movement that said reform, the time for reform has passed. The time for reform, all these reforms, body cameras didn't help. All these reforms didn't do it. I think it was true believers who thought a revolution might bring a better answer. And so you had these autonomous zones embraced by the city, embraced by the elite. And then you had more broadly a movement to defund and abolish the police, which now is famously being walked back. But at the time, to question it was considered crazy. I remember being in situations where I would be like, well, maybe the police could be defunded a little, but not abolished. And that was considered a crazy thing to say at dinner. That was the extent to where the rhetoric went within mainstream media and within the reporter community, which is a very tight-knit, lockstep community, right? The rhetoric had gone so extreme that anything to the right of abolish was fascist.
I remember really distinctly you going to report this story about CHAZ Chop and me being like, this is an unbelievable story. This is the kind of thing a Tom Wolfe or a Joan Didion would have written about. It's incredible. And you had a really different reaction from some people at the New York Times about this story specifically. What was it?
Basically, when I was heading to report that story, and then when I came back and we published that story, the attacks on me became much more intense. I had colleagues, it sounds so petty now because they were tweeting mean things, okay?
Right.
Fine. It was on Twitter, and they were tweeting really mean things about me.
Yeah.
And it was the first time when I realized, this kind of social shaming that's happening quietly in the cafeteria or over drinks or whatever, this is going to become public. And this is going to become a thing I have to deal with in the public sphere. And I could, not that I've memorized all the mean tweets, but let's just say they think I was a fascist and anyone who reports on CHAZ and CHOP is a monster. And no, they were mean. It was really nasty. It was like middle school, but the pettiest middle schoolers you can imagine.
I know.
Imagine them real nasty, but kind of good writers. And
they're really good at being mean.
Yeah, yes. The person who's the lead kind of soldier of censorship is a low-level wire cutter writer.
Right.
Who was in the all-company Slack leading brigades against the top politics reporters. And the top politics reporters would have to get in the muck and argue with her.
Well, that was one of the crazy things that happened is the newspapers, anything, rely on a hierarchy.
Yeah.
And what happened because of Slack and because of Twitter was there was just a total flattening of that.
It was a very bizarre thing that the paper allowed to happen and in some ways encouraged to happen.
Say more about that. Because I think the Times, if someone...
Because it was good for your career, internally.
Why?
Because the leadership of the Times, the top leadership didn't love this, obviously. They had the old school values. They wanted good journalism. And it was that the broader movement was beyond controlling. And within that movement, you could rise up. So you could rise up among your colleagues by going after a reporter who stepped out of line. And you were applauded, and you sort of rose in prestige among the cohort of reporters. And so it was a good career move to do that. It was. Even if the bosses didn't love it, it was good. You rose in the estimation of your colleagues. And I knew that. I knew that the people who were doing these things to me or to others were going to win within the context of the paper. And I knew that I was going to lose. I also knew that The pressure you have as a reporter when you're doing controversial stories, which I often do, is enormous. You're going into the arena, you're in battle, you're doing an investigation. The person might not like it. You're writing about something that isn't flattering, you're going to get pushback. And throughout my career, I've written stories where I get pushback because of my personality, because of the kind of things I write, because I make a little fun, or I make a little this, or I report on something they didn't want me to write about, or whatever. That's the job of a reporter, is you're in the arena and you're not pleasing everyone, and that's okay, and you've got to be tough. But I could only do that from a place where my colleagues and my editors are standing behind me. And you can only do that if you know that you're in an institution that will keep you
protected, have your back.
Yeah, that will have your back. And I was increasingly aware that that wasn't the case, and that actually my colleagues were the ones who were going to make my life very, very hard. They were going to publicly criticize my stories. They were going to engage with the nastiest trolls. Then they were going to use every private thing I did within the newspaper. Everything I said in every meeting would suddenly be shared with outside. I started getting calls from reporters from other publications who had knowledge of things that only could be known if my colleagues were telling them. And I had nothing to be ashamed of. I was proud of my work, proud of the things I was saying, which was pitching more stories. But I was realizing, oh, wow, this world is going to tighten around me. And at the same time then, was honestly very influential for me, was the Donald McNeil situation, where I saw a Times man who'd been there his whole career. He devoted himself to the newspaper. And without getting into the details, because it's like silly and too much and bizarre, honestly, I saw his life get destroyed by this movement in a very irrational way. And I saw him get his entire reputation destroyed very, very gleefully. And I just saw this really kind of noble man
ruined
by this movement. And it upset me. So I was pissed off for his sake, but also I was thinking, okay, so let's say I make it through this period of time.
Right.
Let's say I just
muscle through.
Then what? This movement, once it wants to destroy your reputation, it will succeed. If you want to stay within one of these institutions and the movement of,
if you want to stay in the old prestige world,
yeah,
then you have to make accommodations to it if you want to protect your reputation and your career.
Yeah, and if you don't, it will destroy your reputation and your career. And at that point, I hadn't been canceled. I had all my bits and bops. I was feeling still pretty confident, and I was sort of like,
I'm gonna get out.
Do I want to sit around here until they figure out how to cancel me in some real way? I'm sure I'll say something, like, I don't know, I told someone they had a nice haircut a couple weeks ago. Like, was that illegal? Probably. Like, you start to go paranoid. And so I started to realize, okay, there's really not an option for me to stay.
I think that this story that you're describing and the story I lived through, or the story Donald McNeil through, they're all versions of the same thing, which is you out yourself either intentionally or inadvertently in some way as some kind of heretic to this movement. Then the target is put on your back. And this is especially the case if you are of the wrong identity in some way. They find a way to go after you. And I remember really, really clearly a moment that I was like, this is not going to go well for Nellie. And it was when some like sub-editor or copy editor read one of your stories and accused you of employing the white gaze. And we don't need to go into that story, but the reason I bring it up is because one of the things that was happening at this time that you report on in your new book is the rise of a part of this movement, let's say, that describes itself as being anti-racist. And one of the best chapters in the book, the one The Atlantic recently excerpted, is about you going to one of these sessions with white women who feel really guilty about being white, And they're presumably in this training session to learn how to be good anti-racists. And I remember being astonished by what you encountered in this training session. Can you tell us a little bit about what that period, those few days were like, and how you think it sort of emblemizes this broader movement and the way that it functions?
Yeah. So then after I left the paper, I only had my one skill set. So I decided to write this book, basically doing all the stories I would have wanted to do for the paper. And one of those was on the rise of the modern conception of anti-racism. And what that is a sort of therapeutic model of activist work. And so just to back up on it, I basically become really interested in the work of this one woman, Tema Okun, who had created a list of white supremacy characteristics, white traits. And the list was super popular. It was accepted as completely like just a total given, just gospel at a place like the Times or a place like NPR or in any university. It was so accepted that the Smithsonian Museum made a poster of it. And what the list said was that there were certain white traits, and these were very white, and they were things such as sense of urgency, worship of the written word, individualism, objectivity,
Punctuality.
being on time. And this was accepted as anti-racist. I mean, even saying it out loud, writing about it, I was like, this feels racist to even write. It's crazy. But yes, this was the premier anti-racist thinking. And so when I left the Times, I was sort of like, okay, let's report on this. Why not? Like, let's keep going. And what I kind of discovered through reporting on her, the list, its creation, and its popularity, most importantly. Because anyone can make a list of crazy things, but why did it win? And it won because for a long time, the work of anti-racists, the work of making the world less racist, making the world better for people of different races, making the world more equal, was hard work. And it involved making incremental changes. It involved getting a lot of people together to petition for small local changes, for laws to change. Really hard, requires compromise, requires all this stuff. It involved trying to organize groups of white women in Berkeley to do letter writing campaigns, to get Congress interested in atrocities happening in third world countries, this kind of work. And the list and the new movement that rose said, you don't need to do that anymore. Actually, the work of anti-racism, the work of equality and justice, is work that just has to happen inside you. And it's work that you just work on yourself. And it says, sit with yourself. Are you white? Are you a white woman in particular? Sit with yourself. Work on your own internalized whiteness, which is manifest as your perfectionism, your objectivity. You're always feeling like you're late? That's part of your internalized whiteness. Release that. And it turns out that a lot of people really found that appealing, and that was a lot more intuitive and interesting to people than the hard, obnoxious work of doing legislation. And just mind you, these folks will say explicitly, it is not a white person's job to expand, let's say, the boardroom. It's your job to try to dismantle the boardroom. It's not your job to sort of raise things up. That's implying that you know where things should go. That's implying that that there's a standard that should be met or something, like that a math class should be better. Why like that? Don't get involved with that. That's not right. You need to change your expectations of the world and change yourself. And so I went to a Robin DiAngelo inspired course. She was a speaker, but there was a lot more than just her involved with it. And did a chapter on being in that class and on the work of excavating your internal
I
whiteness.
want to read part of it, okay? I want to read part of one of the exercises that you describe in the book. The facilitators will tell you, and this is a quote, before you can abolish whiteness, you need to feel your white skin. You need to activate it. You tap on your white skin, then do a foot massage, work with each toe carefully, then slap the bottom of your feet. Then you need to find your spine of dignity. And then, and you write, this is not a joke, you were asked to sway like snakes. You're told you should begin to rock. And when you push yourself too far to the edge, just rock in place and do 3 communal hums to settle the nervous system. So you're doing these, to read that, it sounds almost like it is feel your white skin, tap on your white toe. There's something so disturbing and retrograde about like reifying whiteness in that way. That's very disturbing.
Yeah, a big part of the movement is identifying deeply with your race, identifying deeply as white. And it's a very psychologically powerful experience going into an anti-racist training course. And I'll say there's a reason that it has succeeded so well. And it's not just because it's more fun to do and more fun to sort of self-flagellate than it is to work on legislation, which, sure, yes, it is, of course. But also in that part of the anti-racist work is you have to identify as white and you have to say, my whiteness is not neutral. It's not that there's a person who is black or brown and then I'm sort of this neutral non-race. It's that white is also a race. And I think that there is an element of truth to the idea that white people in America can live and kind of pretend like race doesn't exist. But if you're not white, I don't think you have that privilege. And I don't think that you can pretend race doesn't exist because it comes up, people bring it up, people see you as racial. And a lot of the anti-racist movement was saying, we got to change that. Everyone has a race. We all have color. We all have this or that. And so, but what that looks like in real life is having a group of white people get around and start to identify very strongly as white and try to define whiteness.
You talk about one woman in this course explaining that her very existence that perpetuates whiteness makes her feel shame and fear. And I'm just going to read 2 things that she said in the course. The darkest place I go is thinking it would be better if I weren't here. It would be at least one less person perpetuating these things. There's another woman in the group that talks about the harm and the suffering that she's causing her non-white husband because, as she puts it, she is constantly perpetuating toxic whiteness in him.
Yeah, because what the movement says is that you have to acknowledge your whiteness and you have to try to fight it, but there's nothing you can do to escape it, and your whiteness is inherently harmful and inherently toxic to people who aren't white. And so what it creates is an ideology that says, actually, races shouldn't mix. And actually, white people do more harm. Even if you love your husband very much, you're harming him. And you're probably harming your child. And there's no, path out other than just working forever to dismantle, quote unquote, whiteness. And what I'll say is why it was so important to report on, because this psychological therapeutic anti-racist movement took the smarts, the hard work, the time, the money of a bunch of people who wanted to make the world better and said, this is the way to do it. And my argument now, after having taken the courses and sort of stepping back, is I don't think this really improves people's lives a whole lot. I don't think this actually makes things better for people of color. This doesn't make things better for people who are in a shitty situation, let's say in a bad public school, and they need the school to be better. It doesn't improve things. It didn't bring tangible benefits to folks. And I think it was allowed to proliferate and grow in that direction because no one was covering it critically. and no one was saying, wait a minute, does this really do anything to make something better for like a Hispanic guy who's wanting XYZ improvement in his life? No, not really. And I think that it applied to so many facets of the last few years, and the movement that I used to see as my movement, which was progressive politics. And you see it with the Black Lives Matter corporate, right? Black Lives Matter is a very good name for a major fundraising operation. And it was a major fundraising operation that raised money off of the names and faces, literally, of murdered Black children. What exactly did that big nonprofit do with that money? To report on that, to ask that, was considered white supremacy, was considered racist. It was not allowed within the mainstream media. And it took a few years until finally you saw some in the liberal media start to report on what did happen with those finances. But it was years after all the money had been raised off of those faces and those names. And you see the parents of those kids say, we're not seeing a penny of this. Why are you raising this money off of my child?
Like Tamir Rice's mom.
Yeah,
in the
Tamir
book.
Rice's mom. I quote, I mean, this one is like haunting. This kid is shot within seconds of the cops pulling up to a park. He's killed. And BLM uses this horrific moment to raise enormous amounts of money. And it doesn't, not only does it not benefit the family, which you could make arguments that say, sure, this isn't about giving cash to the mom or whatever, although it probably ought to be, but it's about doing these real changes. But what real changes happen? The leaders of BLM go and buy themselves beautiful party homes. They buy, basically, they just have a lot of fun with the cash. And so by not covering it, by not reporting on it critically, by ignoring it or just celebrating it blindly and saying anything else is racist, you allow a movement, or you allow things that are actually toxic, that are actually doing the opposite of good, that are taking good intentions, that are taking money from well-intentioned people, friends of ours, people we like, nice, kind people who want to help the world be better, taking their money and basically stealing it and basically using it for whatever they want, whatever silly ways. And it was time and again in all of the sort of branches of progressive action that I often support. No one wants Tamir Rice to get shot. No one wants people to wander around saying racist things. It was time and again things that were, I thought I wanted the same outcome, but the process becomes this corrupt nightmare. And to report on it or question it is to be on the wrong side of history, to be on the side of evil. And that to me is the most frustrating part of the last few years.
One of the areas where you have policies that many sort of good liberals are going along with, thinking that these are just, these are fair, this is what social justice looks like, are the policies that your hometown of San Francisco has embraced.
Yeah.
Right? And whether it's decriminalizing drug use, open air drug sites, whether it's, well, why don't you tell us what the story of San Francisco over the past decade?
My argument is basically that San Francisco is America, but 5 years ahead. So you can see where a lot of progressive policies play out. You can see what it looks like. And now, in my hometown, you can see the backlash. So, and the course correction and the reform that's happening. But for many years, the city of San Francisco, run at every level by progressives. Like, I'm not even talking about, this isn't like, there's not like a moderate Democrat inside. Everyone's a progressive. Everyone's a leftist. It's just sort of, which, are you Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren? It became a city where the ideals and the message were all that mattered, and the actual thing you were seeing, I hate to use the phrase, but the lived experience of being in San Francisco betrayed the rhetoric.
Yes.
So the harm reduction and drug legalization, basically, which is what happened there for years, the harm reduction policies, which were like, we're not going to try to make people get clean from drugs. We're just going to make it less likely that they're going to very quickly die of the drug. We're going to bring them food. You walk around the city of San Francisco, and there are blocks and blocks where, as you're walking, you're passing people who are just on the sidewalk, slowly dying. It's always been a reality of West Coast cities that you would see people come for the services to use drugs, and because it tended to be more lax in the weather. But over the last few years, you saw that accelerate, and it required coarsening yourself to live in San Francisco, LA to some extent, but we don't walk as much here. So you're not in it as much. But in San Francisco, it required living in such a way that you told yourself you were being a good progressive by walking past a person whose limbs were rotting and who was very clearly dying on the sidewalk. And to walk past them was the only proper solution. And what I mean is that they were getting tons of services. They were getting tons of support. They often had food. They often have food next to them. They've got a clean tent. They've got all the supplies. But the adamant, fierce empathy behind policies that say we are not going to force anyone to get clean before we give them support on the street. We are not going to force anyone to stop doing drugs. We're not going to get involved here other than to help and to support as they slowly die. And our job as the city and as doctors hired by the city is just to kind of support them and make it as painless a death on that sidewalk as possible. And that was the progressive take on what to do. And it just, at a certain point, I mean, my whole life I grew up in the city. I was a reporter in the city. I obviously saw that my whole life. And at a certain point, I just called bullshit. And I just was like, this isn't empathetic. This isn't kind. This is someone dying on the sidewalk, walking past them or leaving them some food or making sure they get a monthly stipend from the city is not empathy. It's slowly helping them die. And once I noticed that, I started seeing a lot of what else was going on in the city. And you start to see it's not hypocrisy because they're saying what they mean and they're doing what they mean. It's that actually maybe some of the policies I used to believe in were flawed. And maybe some of them were not just flawed, but really wrong and maybe kind of actually cruel.
Well, when we met, I remember one of our early times we met, we were talking about school choice, and it was an issue that I had covered a lot when I was on the editorial page, on the op-ed page of the Journal, and you were like, oh, I'm against charter schools. And I was like, why? And it was just one of the things at the time that was like, okay, if you're a good progressive, like you need to be on the side of unions and you need to be against school choice. And I think that you maybe started to question that, when algebra itself became something that was verboten in a place like San Francisco.
And this was a story that I wanted to do this big San Francisco story at the Times, and it obviously wasn't going to be possible. And I first published it in the Atlantic. And so one factor was watching people die on the street, and the other factor was realizing some of the really insane policies around education that were in the city. The city decided to drop accelerated 8th grade algebra. And so 8th graders could no longer test into accelerated algebra, which had been a real pathway for a lot of kids who were good at math to get into better high schools, to then be more competitive applicants for college, whatever. All the reasons why you want to be able to take calculus senior year of high school and all that. It was banned. It was made illegal to teach, basically. And what happened then immediately is that any kid from a middle-class family, where the family can afford to pay for tutors, they would do just 8th grade algebra separately, paid by their parents. Yeah. And it just was an insane notion. This idea that we should not allow accelerated courses doesn't make sense. It only makes sense in a punitive way. It only makes sense actually in the way of how the anti-racist movement says the goal is not to improve the situation. The goal is not to expand the boardroom. The goal is to dismantle the boardroom. So it only makes sense in the way of the argument that says excellence in math and rewarding the excellent is not the goal and actually is an evil act. And actually is the word of the day. It's racist. All of this was happening in my hometown. And I ended up doing a story not just on all these sort of wacky things that were going on or very upsetting things in the case of what was going on with overdoses in San Francisco. More people overdosed on fentanyl than died of COVID in San Francisco per year. But what I ended up reporting on was the Reformation movement. And this was a thing that actually made me really hopeful, which was basically a bunch of liberals got together in the city and said, enough is enough. Like, we're opening our eyes and seeing the reality of the world and seeing the overdose deaths soar and seeing kids struggling in these public schools, unable to learn accelerated math, then getting screwed for college or whatever. We're opening our eyes and seeing the reality of what's happening in the city. And we want to make some changes. And so all of a sudden, San Francisco had an internal liberal reformation. You had, for the first time in decades, a recall of not just the school board. The school board had gotten in particular trouble because they had been talking about how Asian parents are actually secretly all white supremacists, but also a recall of the district attorney. As we're in the intensity of 2020, 2021, 2022, I saw in San Francisco a movement I really identified with, which was kind of the moderate liberals standing up and saying, enough is enough. We want to be based in reality. We want to be doing things that actually help people.
I think people will hear this conversation and we'll be talking about CHAZ or Portland or this Robin DiAngelo training or how algebra's racist and think, okay, all absurd. But are you just nitpicking here? Are you just picking up on the most absurd excesses of the American left and claiming that it's something bigger than it is? What would you say to the person who asked that?
I would say that that's willful naivete on their end. I would say that to pretend like Robin DiAngelo wasn't an enormously influential figure, that the list of white supremacy characteristics wasn't enormously influential, even though you had the Smithsonian Museum making a poster of it, to pretend like the policies around homelessness and drugs were some fringe, silly thing, when the entire American West follows these. To pretend like this was silly sideshows is to lie. And maybe you want to lie now. Maybe you're embarrassed about it. Maybe you want to say, no one ever said abolish the police. This is what people say now. I know. I'm aware. But it happened, and I was there. And people did argue to abolish the police. People did argue that accelerated math is racist. They still argue that. I mean, the memory holding that we're seeing, or the attempt to pretend like these arguments are more rational than they are, I don't blame people. I probably would too.
Nell, the last chapter of your book, I think, is just so beautiful and vulnerable. And it's really about your decision to break away from the old world. And I want you to tell us about the kind of decision point you faced about whether or not to join in on canceling someone who was a colleague and is now a good friend of ours, and why you decided not to.
Yeah. So my real end with the movement came when I didn't cancel someone. And before that, I'd canceled a person or two. I'd been part of it. I'd been part of whatever the call of the day was. I hadn't questioned it. And I'd done it quite gleefully.
Why What's gleeful about it? What's joyful about canceling someone?
In one of the chapters, I write about canceling a friend. And it was a positive experience doing it because I felt immense camaraderie with my community while I was doing it. I felt like I was doing justice. And the person I was canceling was someone who was just very similar to me, very closely aligned politically, but had stepped out of line a little bit.
I just want to read this line that I think is so true and smart, where you say, a cancellation isn't about finding a conservative and yelling at them. It's about finding the betrayer in your midst.
Yeah, so I had been a very good soldier of the movement, but there was a day that came when I couldn't join in a cancellation mob. And it sounds so, I keep saying this, but it's so silly. But when you're in it, they feel like the most important thing in the world. And basically, there was a young man, a colleague of both of ours, who had been involved with an op-ed that got everyone really upset that day. And we were all supposed to tweet that the op-ed put our Black colleagues in danger and basically call for this young man to be fired. And I couldn't do it. I have this anxiety response where my arms go limp when I'm really anxious. Like it's like a psychosomatic problem. And I remember sitting in the apartment and my arms were limp and I was sweating and I was just like, this is so pathetic. Like, I can't believe I can't do this, but I just couldn't cancel him. I couldn't tweet out the tweet we were all supposed to tweet. And because of that, I mean, also for a listener, this is the only point of mild bravery in the entire book. It's all about me going along with everything. And the only thing I do to like mildly protest is just not do a cancellation one time. So this is my heroics. And I just couldn't do it. And I didn't do it.
And what happened?
And from that, several friends reached out and on that very day ended their friendships with me. It was stunning. One very good friend. And it was so shocking to me. And I realized that I was done. That the movement was done with me and I was done with the movement. And I just couldn't force it anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think part of what had happened was, I think it was two things. I'm really close with a lot of my family members. They all have really different politics. Some of them are really conservative. I mean real conservatives. I don't mean like never Trumpers like your dad over here. I mean like Trumpers. I mean like Trump might be a little soft people.
and we may or may not be thinking of the same uncle who we love.
And I love my family members. And I was having a really hard time with some of the really wild rhetoric that was being said about folks like this. It wasn't sitting right with me. And so there was that was happening kind of in my heart where I was like, I can't say this about everyone who disagrees with me politically is not like a Nazi who deserves to be like have their vote taken away. It just isn't the case. They just disagree, but we can still all have a nice Thanksgiving. And so there was that. And then there was also that we were together. I'd fallen in love with you fully and completely. And you were someone who this group was constantly trying to cancel and constantly trying to disavow and constantly disavowing. And so I had seen that, and I'd seen how absurd it was and how flattening this movement was and how flat it wanted to make our lives, how uncomplicated, when life is complicated and politics are complicated and humans are complicated. And like, I just am not going to like put these strict, ridiculous boundaries on who can be in my world and who can't be. So anyway, so those two factors made it so I just couldn't cancel that day. I couldn't tweet the tweet. I couldn't tweet the fucking tweet. The one thing I needed to do, and I couldn't do it. And then it was done. And then I was really out. So that was the end of that era of my life, really. And it felt, I mean, in the same way that I felt the camaraderie of being part of canceling people and the camaraderie of being part of feeling on the side of justice, releasing myself from the confines of that movement also felt good.
I think a lot of people who have followed your work or followed your tweets or whatever will say, well, you've changed, Nellie. You've changed. You know, they may use a phrase like you've been red-pilled, or you became right-wing, or you've been mugged by reality, or, you know, you grew up, and, you know, to be young is to be a leftist, to be older is to be a conservative. Like, have you changed? How do you grapple with the person that says, you know, you've changed? Is it true or is it not true?
Of course it's true that I've grown and evolved, and that I see evidence, and my ideas and politics change based on evidence. Like, I used to be really adamant about drug legalization, and the more I saw those streets in San Francisco, the first less adamant I became, and then now I think drug legalization is maybe not a good idea. Maybe fentanyl should be illegal, which I think technically it is in most places, but it's not in practice, right? But I reject the movement that says, unless you are for the totality and extreme sort of new random fringe philosophy here, random fringe political belief you need to have, unless you're for that, you're out. You're right wing, you're red pilled, you're this. And I just reject that idea of these two random extremes. I don't, just because I didn't cancel a friend that day doesn't mean all of a sudden, okay, yeah, I'm also pro-life.
Right.
But yeah, I also think life can begin in the petri dish, and now we have to, it's like this idea that because you're not for every plank of something, that you're completely on the out, you're right wing. I mean, that is what the movement says, certainly. And that is what my critics say. And that's their prerogative. They can say that, and they'll scream it from rooftops. I mean, basically anyone who strays a tiny bit from whatever the absolute progressive orthodoxy of the day is labeled a right-winger. And it doesn't matter what your politics are, actually. It just matters that little hair that you strayed. And you really wronged there. And by doing that little stray, all of you is suspect, and all of you is gone, and the biggest insult that the community can think of is, you're right wing. Which is fine. I mean, it's just funny because I believe in universal health care and I'm pro-choice and all of these things. So it's technically not true, but I'm sort of like, whatever, you know, whatever labels you want to throw at people, they throw labels about everything. And in a lot of ways, it makes a lot of the labels like, you know, the movement ruined terms like sexist or racist or homophobic by using it to describe everything. So then when we're actually confronted with like a Nick Fuentes, we've run out of words. We don't have the words to describe him, because if everyone is racist and toddlers are racist, then how in the hell do you describe Nick Fuentes? You're tongue-tied because you used it up. And so sure, the movement would describe me. I'm sure at this point they'd call me homophobic. I don't know, but yeah, I reject it.
Well, one of the things that you're doing is building the free press with me, and I guess I would love to maybe end there. Is like, I didn't have the same, I don't know, I wasn't wearing the same rose-colored glasses when I went to the New York Times. I thought, can't believe I made it here. Let's see how long it lasts. You thought, I'm going to be here forever, and my new last name is I'm Nellie Bowles of the New York Times. Well, now you're Nellie Bowles of the Free Press, and we're building this new thing. And we're trying, I think, in our way to uphold the values and pursue the curiosity that led us both in our way to become journalists in the first place, but to do it without the tightening that I think you so powerfully capture in Morning After the Revolution. So how's it going? And how does it feel to be part of a new journalistic enterprise when, you were the girl that sat in front of the mirror practicing saying, I'm Nellie Bowles of the New York Times?
Letting go of the prestige mindset is not easy, especially for like a good American girl who's always been a good student and wants to be good and wants to please. Because the old institutions have rotted themselves out. They are empty from the inside. They have the names. They have the gorgeous branding. Gorgeous. The slogans are hollow. And so you have to release them. You have to accept that hollowness and live your life accordingly. And I think starting our own thing, it's been unbelievable.
The title of this book is Morning After the Revolution. And that implies that we're after it. And I think a lot of people in this moment are looking at, they call it this, at least at Harvard, the student intifada. Or they're looking, all around the country at evidence that the revolution is not just after, it's just beginning. How do you understand sort of where we are in the life of this thing that you wrote about here and that you continue to capture every single week in your column for the Free Press?
I think there's two answers to that. But first, the revolution didn't end because it lost. It ended because it won. And it doesn't need to be as loud as it was. It doesn't need to be huge, thousands and thousands of people in this street lighting buildings on fire anymore, because the revolution that I'm writing about is now fully ingrained in our American institutions. It's the DEI statement you have to write in order to get a job at any university. It's fully enmeshed in our corporate life, in every layer of American liberal and American elite, every museum job, it's one. It doesn't need to be so loud. Now, as to what's happening on college campuses, obviously that's a new kind of explosion of a lot of what we've seen over the last years. It's another iteration of it. And I think back a lot to the Antifa movement. And at the time, it was considered, as we've talked about, so controversial to say that Antifa was part of things because it was controversial to say that the threat of violence was part of things.
Yeah.
And the win now, the reason why the revolution is done and has won is because now in all of those protests, there's not an effort to downplay that violence is on the table. And you hear it in the rhetoric. You hear it in, there's only one solution, intifada revolution. You hear it in glory to our martyrs. This is the glorification of violence, and these are calls for violence. These are not anti-war protests. These are pro-war protests, which is fine. You argue for a war, argue for violence. The media should at least call it what it is. But I think now we're entering the kind of post-revolution moment where all of those goals that we saw have been now achieved.
Thanks for
Mary Weiss, my wife.
Nellie Bowles, my wife.
What are we having for lunch?
I'm starving.
This was a pleasure.